I love this question is what can we do to de-escalate? Do you think Sanders and Khanna's resolution they just introduced has enough teeth? And that's a great question because it speaks to how Democrats helped get us here. And we can talk more about this in a bit, but let me just say that just a week ago or so, Democrats helped pass this National Defense Authorization Act, this massive military budget to Trump, and Democrats rejected an amendment from Sanders and Khanna that would have called on Trump. It would have said that Trump cannot go to war against Iran without congressional approval. And Democrats helped kill that.
188 House Democrats joined virtually all of the Republicans.
A part of the long road in which Democrats helped pave the way for Trump's launching this war on Iran with his assassination of Soleimani. Going back to when Chuck Schumer was campaigning against even Obama's Iran nuclear deal. And we can talk more about that. But what needs to happen in order for there to be the forces in the U.S. that could make Trump pay a domestic political cost? Because if you look at right now the Democratic response, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Adam Schiff, other prominent Democrats, nobody questioning Trump's warmongering with Iran, really. The critique of Trump, if there is one, being on very narrow process grounds. He didn't consult with Congress. He doesn't have a plan. It reminds me of when John Kerry was trying to run against George W. Bush in 2004, but he was in a bind because he himself, like Joe Biden, had voted for Bush's war in Iraq. That Kerry's line was, sure, Bush had a plan for the war, but he didn't have a plan to win the peace, which of course failed disastrously. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the Democrats here and the direction of the anti-war movement in 2003. You touched on it a little bit before. It felt so strong back then. All of us took part in these massive rallies, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. There was that famous one in New York City, others around the world and around the country. But now all of that is sapped. And you mentioned earlier that now the anti-imperial force inside the U.S. is pretty tiny, as represented by the small numbers that come out to protest against the murderous sanctions and coup attempt in Venezuela or the coup attempt in Bolivia. So what do you think needs to happen to rebuild an anti-war force in this country? And why do you think it's been sapped so much in the Trump era?
Well, there's so much to say there, but I always think about what Brian Becker, who helped form the Answer Coalition and launched those early massive protests against the push for invasion of Iraq, said that he realized the protests were so big because many people were protesting what they saw as the Republican war on Iraq. And they saw it through a completely partisan lens and were just opposing Bush more than they were opposing the war on principle. So when Bush left office, then the consensus returned, and Obama managed to basically suffocate the anti-war movement, even as he continued to wage catastrophic regime change wars, starting with Libya. What's interesting right now is that we're actually seeing, I guess I would call it anti-war agitation on the right, really on the far right. Sort of the legacy of Pat Buchanan, the ghost of Pat Buchanan looms over the Republican Party. And these kind of forces helped put Donald Trump in the White House when he appealed to them as an anti-interventionist. And they're now embodied in the form of, Tucker Carlson, someone whose views we on immigration and on race we despise. But, me and you have gone on his show, and the reason to go on his show is to send a message to Trump because a Republican is in the White House, a Republican has his finger on the trigger, and Donald Trump watches Tucker's show every night, and everybody knows that Tucker has the ear of Donald Trump. And Tucker spent his show tonight just destroying Donald Trump's rationale for assassinating Soleimani and attacking Iraq. And that's a really interesting development. Meanwhile, you flip the dial to MSNBC and you'll see Chris Hayes doing none of that. Someone who came out of The Nation magazine, which we've both written for, just rolling along with this sort of intelligence deep state coup. And, the way that opposition to Trump has been mobilized on MSNBC has been to mobilize people against Trump because he's not warlike enough. And for the past weeks, and you've been, screaming the most about this, what have Democrats opposed Trump on? Not sending military aid to Ukraine, not sending offensive Javelin missiles to a military that has incorporated a neo-Nazi force, the Azov battalion, into its ranks to ramp up a proxy war with Russia. Now suddenly everybody has to kind of reposition themselves and recalibrate themselves psychologically because we need to oppose Trump against war. And that feels so unfamiliar. You have to go back 15 years to remember what that was like. And then meanwhile, you have the far right guy who everyone's, calling a white supremacist, mobilizing Republicans against war. It's like, it feels like we're in an upside down world. And now is really the moment with Bernie out there and Tulsi Gabbard, who I think has run a fairly effective protest campaign. Now's the moment to seize the momentum. I think we're going to start seeing these anti-war rallies get larger, especially if the U.S. continues pushing Iran to respond. And it's time for Bernie to pivot against Joe Biden and point out the fact that Biden not only voted for the Iraq war, but that Biden whipped votes in support of the invasion of Iraq. Biden played a pivotal role in the Senate in driving support for the invasion of Iraq and created the context for this catastrophe. And if Bernie doesn't point that out, starting now, he doesn't have the killer instinct to win.
Now, what's amazing about Biden right now is that he's not even owning up to that as a factual matter. He's trying to be revisionist and claim that he was somehow against Bush's war, that he didn't mean to give him the authorization to invade Iraq, that it was more about compelling military inspections. It's ridiculous, and it's a huge opportunity for Bernie Sanders. I have seen some signs of life from some of Sanders' aides on Twitter, like, for example, David Sirota, who's been hitting this point home, and I hope that extends to Bernie as well.
I think that Bernie actually did say something in the last 24 hours about Biden's Iraq war vote and how that means he's not qualified to be the person in power when something like this happens, like what just happened with Iran or something along those. And then Biden was asked to respond to that. And he was just like, I'm not going to respond to someone like Bernie who has so much baggage or something really stupid like that. But we do see some signs, like in Bernie's, of all the Democrats, I guess he's not really a Democrat, but of all the Democratic people running in the Democratic primary, he is the only one, except for, I don't know if Tulsi Gabbard made a statement, I didn't see, but Bernie was the only one that I saw actually making it about being anti-war and against a war. He didn't say anything he didn't preface his statement with Qasem Soleimani was like a monster and a murderer, but like he just didn't say the guy's name. I would have liked him to go actually say his name. Oh God, Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren was so bad. That's how she prefaced her statement was he was a murderer and like a monster. She used language similar to what I just said. And basically justified him being dead. Her problem was the way Trump went about doing it. It was like the procedural theater that Trump missed out on. I think, and Pete Buttigieg, whose name I will never pronounce correctly because I just can't learn it.
I refuse to say Buttigieg. I will always call him Booty Judge.
I refuse to say it. My brain refuses to say his name right because every time he talks, it bothers me.
When he appeared out of nowhere.
Max, you want to jump in there for a second?
Yeah, this is really uncomfortable to have like ask permission to jump in, but
raise your hand.
Like everybody pass the ball and it's your time to talk. It's like some kind of new age meeting. But I know I was just gonna say when he appeared out of nowhere, out of the ether, I was calling him Buddy Gig, and I didn't get corrected until I gave a talk in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and people actually knew who he was. But back to Rania. It's your turn to talk, Rania.
Thank you. He's passing me the stick. I have the talking stick now. but no, I think what this speaks to is the fact that Sanders is the only candidate who's really said anything that's worth hearing about what's happening in Iran, speaks to how the Democrats are as an opposition. I actually really think there's a case to be made for them being the worst opposition in the history of oppositions.
They're bad.
They're awful. I mean, they've spent all their time with a president like this going after, making it all about Russiagate and making it all about Ukrainegate, as Max pointed out, which was all about being angry that Trump didn't arm neo-Nazis or threaten to stop arming neo-Nazis.
The Minutemen.
the Minutemen. And to now, I mean, every time he bombs anything, they're so supportive of it. And now their only issue is the procedural problems that they weren't let on the inside before it happened. That's their only problem. Every single one of them each time keeps saying the same thing. It's almost, and I think somebody actually showed Liz Cheney side by side with Elizabeth Warren's comment on Twitter. And they actually had several words in a sentence that were exactly the same. He was a murderous, awful monster who deserves to die. There were former Obama administration officials on CNN and MSNBC last night who were saying the same thing. They were like, this guy was a monster. I'm shedding no tears over him. I don't want anyone to mistake what I'm about to say for shedding tears over this guy. It's good that he's dead. The world is a safer place. But it's like, what kind of opposition are you? That's pathetic. These people are pathetic. And I really hope that the Bernie Sanders wing manages to like win and take over. But I guess I'm kind of moving the topic away from what we're supposed to be talking about. But I feel like that's a bit, I don't want to get excited about that. So I'd rather just not.
Really quickly, just because we're talking about it, I'm going to cut to the exact quotes just so people can see if they haven't seen it themselves. This is Elizabeth Warren. Soleimani was a murderer responsible for the deaths of thousands, including hundreds of Americans. But this reckless move escalates the situation with Iran and increases the likelihood of more deaths and new Middle East conflict. Our priority must be to avoid another costly war. And you can see on Twitter, I was very critical of that. And then here's Bernie Sanders' statement. He said, quote, "When I voted against the war in Iraq in 2002, I feared it would lead to greater destabilization of the region. That fear unfortunately turned out to be true. The U.S. has lost approximately 4,500 brave troops. Tens of thousands have been wounded, and we've spent trillions of dollars. Trump's dangerous escalation brings us closer to another disastrous war in the Middle East that could cost countless lives and trillions more dollars. Trump promised to end endless wars, but this action puts us on the path to another one." I'll just jump in with my own opinion really quickly. I was very impressed by Bernie's statement. He didn't have any of these mealy-mouthed qualifiers about the evil boogeyman of empire. He didn't call Soleimani a murderer. By the way, as if generals in the U.S. military aren't they're generals of a military. Their job is literally to kill people. But aside from that, Bernie's statement isn't perfect. He didn't mention, the million Iraqis who died. But I will say that of the various presidential candidates, his response was very impressive. And Max, we'll jump to you, Max.
Yeah, Sarah Lazar, who is a former writer for the Grayzone, who's now in these Times, has a really good tweet, which she made like 5 minutes ago, about a statement by the Progressive Caucus, is supposedly the progressive wing of the House Democrats. And they've said, there's no military solution to this crisis. Let's pursue meaningful diplomacy to achieve peace and stability. And then they released their full statement. Representative Mark Pocan is the chair of the Progressive Caucus, and Sarah just lit into them and said it's an outrage that just last month the Progressive Caucus declined to whip the vote against the NDAA, a $738 billion war budget for Trump, even after it had been stripped of an amendment aimed at blocking war with Iran. They didn't put up a fight, but it's all down the memory hole. And that's exactly right. This should have been the big fight. Tulsi Gabbard had been warning in debates that all it would take was a spark to light a regional war, which Trump and his neocon have been trying to provoke with Iran. And there was an amendment inserted in the NDAA, I think by Tulsi Gabbard, that was stripped out. And none of the Democrats even cared. They went along with Donald Trump. And this is a record budget aimed at fueling his great war competition, including with China. It includes sanctions on China and all kinds of crazy provisions for fighting China. But I had actually gone to Congress. I went up to Capitol Hill with Ben a few days before that amendment was going to come up for a vote. And, there was also a resolution Tulsi was pushing on withdrawing U.S. troops from Syrian oil wells. And we were really unable to find any members of Congress to interview, because that day in the House Ways and Means Committee, there was a hearing on Ukraine Gate, and all business had completely shut down on Capitol Hill. You know how the Democrats say, oh, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can still conduct legislative business while conducting these impeachment hearings. But no, there was no gum chewing taking place or really any walking. There was Adam Schiff and all of their kind of Russiagate propaganda taking place. The whole media had filled the chamber, and the public, which has the ability to go sit in these hearings and line up and wait to sit and watch these supposedly mesmerizing hearings that we get nonstop 24/7 coverage about, had totally lost interest. There were almost no lines for the public to go in, and most of the seats were empty. It was purely a spectacle for the media and Adam Schiff and these, Democrats who have just gone along. And so, there was no discussion about the NDAA. That's what the point of these protests are, I think. If you're part of the anti-war movement, you're not going to be speaking to Donald Trump. And so it's important to do what the DSA has done tonight, which is to be outside Schumer's office. These protests should be directed against the Democrats to get them to actually finally do something, because that's the party that you can affect. And it's nice that Tucker's out there getting in Trump's ear, but I think it's a little bit too late to stop the process that's been put into place of escalation.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here, and I'm gonna actually, we should name and shame the specific Democrats. I mean, there's many of them. I'm not gonna name all of them, but we can talk about some of the specifics. Here I have up a list of the 376 Congress members who voted to, this is for the NDAA. It also includes a $738 billion annual military budget, which is also, by the way, an underestimate of the actual military spending. But you can see 187, which then became 188. 188 Democrats in the House voted along with 189 Republicans. So it's basically evil, evil too. It's even and evil. But it just goes to show that, the majority of the Democratic Party still consists of these neoliberal shills. And some of the only members of the House who voted against it included Tulsi Gabbard, Barbara Lee, who is, of course, the only Congress member to vote against the war in Afghanistan, Ro Khanna, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. You can see I have a list here of the 48 people who voted against it. Mostly Democrats. There are a few Republicans, and also Justin Amash, who's now an independent, libertarian-leaning former Republican. And also, Aaron wanted to jump in here to talk about something we haven't even really got to mention yet, which is the Iran nuclear deal.
Well, yeah, and on this front, we were talking before about how, Bernie has a very strong rhetorical weapon to use against Biden to point out his failed policy record, in contrast that to Bernie, where Bernie has been right, especially on the Iraq war. But there's also the issue of Iran itself, where Bernie Sanders stood apart pretty much from virtually everybody in trying to fight for the Iran nuclear deal. So back in 2017, when Russiagate was in full swing and Democrats were in hysterical Cold Warrior mode and pushing for new sanctions on Russia, they also agreed with Republicans to impose new sanctions on Iran, even though they were warned very vocally that new sanctions on Iran would seriously endanger the Iran nuclear deal, on top of the fact that Trump was already threatening to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. And Bernie Sanders stood apart from everybody else as being the only Democrat in the Senate to vote against the sanctions measure that imposed new sanctions on Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And,
Rand Paul joined him, I believe, right?
Right. Rand Paul on the Republican side.
So he deserves some credit. Yeah.
Yes. But on the Democratic side, nobody else. And I believe no Democrat in the House either at that time, although I think since then you've had more people get some spine on this issue. So, that was a consequence, because no Democrat wanted to oppose a bill that was imposing sanctions on Russia. One way in which Russiagate has helped pave the way for all this. Another way, and we've talked about this, is the way in which liberal energy, instead of being diverted into saving one of President Obama's key signature policies and this, really important agreement, one of the most important international agreements in recent memory.
And one of the only good things Obama did. I mean,
sure.
I mean, he did infinitely many bad things. This is one of his few victories.
What were Democrats doing? They were fixating daily on the belief that there was a conspiracy with Russia and that Robert Mueller was going to prove it. And on that front, I say this is my talking point. I say this every time I open my mouth. There were bigger protests there were bigger liberal protests over the firing of Jeff Sessions than there were over almost anything else, including trying to save the Iran nuclear deal. But Bernie Sanders can point to his efforts, to his attempts to save it. And, you know, there's been talk recently about how Trump doing this to distract from impeachment in the same way that Clinton did that back when he was being impeached. He also bombed Iraq. I do think there's some truth to that. But I want to make clear that there's a causality here that is worth mentioning, which is that I don't think Trump could have gotten to the point where he could have launched this strike had Democrats not totally abandoned being a real resistance and had they put some political capital into saving the Iran nuclear deal, because they basically just abandoned that fight. There's been no effort. There's been no rallies, no serious measures with co-sponsors, no trips to Iran from members of Congress that, you know, could have tried to build up some support for saving the Iran nuclear deal. There's been nothing. It's pretty much just been Russiagate and then impeachment. So while I do think that, yeah, sure, Trump could see a benefit here in launching these attacks and making this the issue and not impeachment, I do think that it was Democrats' inaction and their Cold War hawkishness that promoted war with Russia that has now helped give Trump the space to go ahead and do war with Iran, because who's standing up to him?
I do agree with you, Aaron, but really quickly, just while you're mentioning it, Sam Husseini, who's a really good media critic, has been sharing this a lot on Twitter, and it is pretty uncanny. I mean, I agree with Aaron's analysis that this is not the main point, but I do think that, of course, you know, it's an election year, and Trump is trying to fire up his base, especially the more neoconservative folks who originally had been never Trump Republicans, and many of them are now on board with Trump. And this is what Sam Husseini's been sharing. This is incredible. This is a New York Times front page from the 90s when Bill Clinton was president. Impeachment vote in House delayed as Clinton launches Iraq airstrike, citing military need to move swiftly. Now, of course, that was a different situation, and that attack was a very clear example of a distraction because, I mean, it was still a blatant crime, a blatant war crime, totally illegal under international law, a blatant act of aggression. But he didn't kill one of the top Iranian generals, who is such a major figure inside Iranian generals and Iraqi generals. I mean, Trump that killed. So clearly this attack is very different, but there's some interesting parallels.